experienced, but not that we will never experience, because we have this hope of expectation of the glory of God. But it's really important, first off, is to look at this chasm, this separation. It's important to have a clear doctrine in our minds while we look at the Bible of separation. What does it mean that they were separated? When Adam sinned, he brought about death on himself. It wasn't physical death, not right away. But it was a spiritual death right away. It meant you are cast out. You're sort of a prodigal son. He left God's kingdom, God's presence. He was kicked out. He's far away from God. God has a sort of this beautiful earth that's just unkempt and sort of chaotic. And then he creates this little garden right there in the center. And he makes it beautiful and pruned, and everything's sort of harmonious. And he puts man right there in the center of the garden to work it and to keep it and to have his paradise there. And the man, he gets kicked out of this garden and is actually now taken into the jungle. He's outside of the harmony and now lives in the chaos in chaos. And now the earth just produces thorns and thistles when he tries to garden. He can't just go out into this chaotic area now and just start making it the paradise that he once had before. He's going to be met with not God's blessing. He's going to be met with the issues of living life separated from God. It means he's going to be worried about animals now. He's going to eventually be worried about his offspring going out and creating other nations to become an enemy to him. So now he's got to build up sort of this is mankind, not necessarily Adam, but this is how it comes about, is now all of a sudden murder is happening among your children. Now all of a sudden there's nations being made from the descendants of your children, and they're waging war against each other. So now you can't just, even if you had a little paradise, you couldn't even live in it, because now you'd have to create a military just to protect yourself. And so far, I mean, it didn't take long before man, taken out of the presence and privilege of God, was actually just living in fear, and just his eyes just became completely set on the things of the world, right? He's not concerned with God. He's not close to God. He doesn't feel the closeness of God. And so it's really about what the five senses can draw in for him, which is a dangerous place to be, and is really the symptom of our separation from God. And if God would have left us just like that, the Bible would have probably never been written, or it would be a very, very short book. But God, rather, he takes a people and he makes, he says, you will be my people and I will be your God. And he gives them commandments. And so out of all of the ungodly, out of all of the people that lived in complete separation from God, God is saying, this is not how I want it to be. And so he takes a people and he doesn't bring them into his presence, but he says, I will bless you. I will give you everything. All you have to do is follow these commandments. You need to listen to these commandments. We went over the 10 commandments last week. Really, the 10 commandments unpack into the Levitical standard, which is found in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Scholars have counted them up to be like 630 laws that were given to Israel, telling them, you keep these commandments, you will obtain the blessing of God. And they raise their hand and they say, all that you've commanded, this we will do. And so there's a way to react and respond to the law. And there's ways not to. We're going to look at that. We all want validation. That's what this issue really is is when we're separated from God, we really don't have validation. This is what we really long for. We want to be validated by God. We want to be validated by our friends and our family. The first thing a child wants when they're born, when they're being raised, is they want validation from their parents. Nothing is more harmful to a child's psyche than never pleasing their parents. It's always just so difficult to make my dad happy. Always so difficult to make my mom happy. That kind of a thing. We all are, as social creatures, we would never thrive in isolation. We would never thrive without the warmth and the light of being social. We're designed for that. But more than that, we're designed to be social with God, to have fellowship with God, to be validated by God, for God to put His hand on us. And that's why there's so much death and sin in the world, is because really that hand is not there. It's not there for those who hate God. And ever since the separation from Adam, this is why the world is so empty inside. That's why 1 out of 3 people is prescribed antidepressants. That's why the biggest section in Barnes & Noble is self-help. Everybody knows there's something broken in the world. Even the most ardent, calloused-hearted man who hates humanity, who hates God, who doesn't even think that the 10 Commandments or morality is really anything, that really everything's subjective. If you and then what happens in Europe, where a man sets off a bomb and kills 23 people and injures 100 more, even the most wicked, hard-hearted person would say that's wicked. There's something wrong with that. We all know that there's something broken in the world, and really when we decide, when we come close and realize we need God, we are met with the brick cold wall of the law. Those 10 Commandments come first. Those 10 Commandments come first, and it's really our responsibility to react to those 10 Commandments. And this is what I mean by that. I'm not being daunting, because we're looking at the most beautiful text in the world, but right here, in what Paul is saying, is in the context of being justified by faith. And that word justified is a law-centered word. It's a courtroom word. And the court does not exist without the law. Okay? So, the 10 Commandments are given, and there's 3 responses. By and large, there's 3 responses. There's the prideful or ridiculously naive way to respond to the law, which says, whatever you command, this I will do. Now, to respond to the law in that way is exactly what God spends the rest of the Bible explaining how not to do it. Because what they did was, they became, in the end, these people are the ones that put Jesus on the cross. These people are the ones that saw themselves as so holy and devout that that when they saw Jesus, they even, or in John the Baptist, they even judged him. And so this is pride. And pride is the mother that is pregnant with all sins. And pride leads to hard-heartedness and misery, really. The second way, and we looked at that last week, that's kind of like the topic of last week was looking at some pride, though we're going to look at some more here. But this really religion is what comes about from that first response. Is this I can earn the right standing before God. This is every religion other than Christianity that says this. This is the heart of every religion, even the Buddhist that doesn't necessarily believe in a God, but does things like meditates to try to be closer to God, or starves himself to try to be closer to God, or does good things to sort of be closer to, not God, but a sort of a sense of peace, a sort of a sense of validation. They have to work toward these things. It's not this everyday thing. It's something they have to learn. You know, take a look at Catholicism, Mormonism, everything. Even the atheists, we all, in ourselves, have a meritorious approach to becoming validated by others and to becoming validated, to receive validation in the deep parts of our heart. And then there's the second response, which is the law is arbitrary. Those 10 Commandments, they have nothing to do with me. They have nothing to do with me. Some guy in the desert wrote those 10 Commandments. They really have nothing to bear on me. You know, I think that a lot of people, I mean, this is sort of the general response to this right now. And I think that Christians as well can fall into this attitude. This is agnosticism, Buddhism, New Ageism, this sort of they receive that brick wall of the law, and they say, I can't do that, and nor will I even try because it's ridiculous, and they try to go around it. And really, I mean, this idea, there is no God. There is no purpose, there is no meaning, there is no one that can save you, there is no God to help you, there is no God to hear you. When that bounces off of you, those words, how does that make you feel? I mean, does that make you feel good to hear those kinds of things? I've listened to atheists that boast that it does. Oh, I was set free when I realized that there was no God. I was set free. No, you weren't. I've seen a meme on Facebook that was like a beautiful picture of the galaxy, and it said there is no meaning and no purpose. And it was like that was some empowering thing that was supposed to be. It was supposed to be some beautiful, empowering message. And it's like, really, in the deep parts of our hearts, when I say to you, everything that you've ever endured, everything that you've ever done, everything that you've ever enjoyed has no meaning behind it. How does that make you feel? Now, I'm not saying that we should derive our truth on how we feel, but I do believe that life begets life and death begets death, and God has designed us in such a way to respond with joy and with gladness to the things that are true. And so this idea that the law is arbitrary, what you're doing is you're saying, I have absolutely no need of Yahweh. And it's not true. And it's the most detrimental thing. And I promise you, it leads to suicide. It leads to despair. Unyielding despair. Because humans, we're not meant to live without meaning and purpose. Honestly, and when we ascribe, everything is so relative, and we are subjected to so much subjectivity. Everything is today, ever since the Enlightenment, is so about relativity. There is no real truth. What's true for you is not true for me. That is so detrimental to your health, to your mind. It's so bad for you. Because think about this. What is a person that is suffering, that is hurt, that is sick, that is mentally ill? What kind of sympathy does a person have when we have no standard of value for that person? When that person is just like a stuck pig or just some other creature. The atheistic mindset would say that humans don't matter. In fact, we've never really mattered. We're probably the worst thing that ever happened to planet Earth. I mean, what kind of taken to a consistent level, what kind of monster does that turn us into when we look at people that are suffering? With that kind of understanding, the best thing that you should do is to never feed the homeless and never help anybody who's sick, because we got to get rid of the people that are sick in order for humanity to advance in evolution. Only the strong survive. We're never going to make it as a species. We're taking care of sick people. But no, we have the doctrine of Imago Dei. That man was made in the image of God and has an integral, intrinsic value and worth and dignity. That we look at even the most poor and pitiful, even the most wicked person, and we don't see something that's common and cheap, even though they might treat themselves and others like that. That person has a soul. That person was made in the image of God. And so anyway, I'm kind of getting off the path. But the fact is that when we take this attitude to the law and say that doesn't apply to me, that's what we're saying. It goes down that whole road. Yeah, it goes down. Starts with there is no God. It goes down the road of unyielding despair. Now there's absolutely no meaning, and now nothing really matters. The only way that an atheistic person can actually summon up any motivation to be good to a person is if they borrow from our worldview. You have to think about that. What is the standard of morality? What makes running away from battle less noble than running toward battle? What makes running as a fireman, running into a fire, more noble than running away from the fire and letting people burn? Who makes that standard? And so that's why the law is so important. And that's why the psalmist can say that he delights in the law, and the law is like honey on his lips. So we look at the law and we might be daunted by it. We might say, oh yeah, I'll do it. And I've even talked to people that say, yeah, I've never sinned. I've never done any of those things. You know, and then you talk to people that say, that's ridiculous. Why would God care what I did with my body? Why would God make so many demands on what I do with my life? You know, the law is arbitrary, and they don't take it to that consistent level. They just forget about it. There's a third response. There's a third response to the law. And it's really, I will rely on grace. I can't do it. I cannot obey the Ten Commandments. I cannot do it, but I see the supremacy of them. I see that God has set this up. I see that it is perfect and just, but I am not. This is proprietary only to Christians. Only a Christian thinks like this. Though some people might speak in ways that resemble this sort of pious attitude, only a Christian can really say this. And that's because of the gospel. Who would be free to say something like, I can't keep the Ten Commandments, but I love God? Who would be free to say that unless they had a forgiving God that fulfilled the Ten Commandments for them and died the death that they deserve? Who could say that other than a Christian? Only a Christian who sees and hates their sin can enjoy this beautiful disposition. And he says, we rejoice in hope of the glory of God. Christians have the validation. Christians are not separate from God. And we rejoice in hope, not in fear that it won't. We rejoice when we're looking at the hope of being in glory with God. We rejoice in that hope. We don't sit there and bite our nails and fear that one day we will not be in glory with God. Look, to fear that one day you will not go to heaven, to fear that one day you will not be with God, to fear that is to not understand God and to not trust God. Because God has not promised that if you put your work on this, if you invest in this, if you are the right kind of guy for the job, I will bring you with me. He says that whoever fears God, trusts God, whoever loves God, whoever believes in God, whoever puts their faith in God will not perish but have everlasting life. That's a promise. Is God trustworthy? Because that's what faith really is. It's an assent to a proposition. Chuck, if I say the check is in the mail. All right, don't worry, I'm getting you paid. The check is in the mail. Whether you have faith in that has everything to do with my character, right? If I'm constantly lying all the time, if you've heard from 3 other guys around town that they heard the same thing and never got the check, then you have no faith in me. Has God not proven His character? Has God not proven Himself over and over and over in the Bible? And that's why it's so important to pick this book up and to read it inside and out constantly. It's because it acquaints you with the character of God and the trustworthiness of God. And so that's why we wait in eager expectation and not in fear that one day we will be with Him in glory. My hope and your hope is not one day that we will be sinless. My hope and your hope is not one day that the 10 Commandments will fall away. My hope and your hope is that one day we will wake up and we'll be with God. One day we will step into that kingdom, reach out our hand, and be met with the hand of God. That's our hope. That's why we're here. But I need you to understand this. If you fear that this is not going to happen, you're not understanding the character of God, and you're not understanding what God has done for you. Heaven is not just a vacation either. Heaven is a vacation for those who love God. Is not just a vacation. It's a place for those who love God. And I promise you, if you love God, you are forgiven. You are loved. You are validated. You put your faith in Jesus Christ, the real Jesus Christ, who He is, what He has. It's a proven character. He promises that by faith alone you are justified. That everything that you've ever done, looking at those 10 Commandments, as daunting as they could actually be, it's been completely washed away. And not only is that awesome, but while we're still here, let's look at the next verse. I love that the Bible would say these kinds of things, because if it really was just about justification, we could be in a lot of trouble, because now we're justified. Now we're in the fold of Jesus Christ, and He's our shepherd. But now we've got 50, 60, 70 years, some of us, to live on earth. What does that mean? Life can be very difficult. And He says, not only do we hope in the glory of God, the hope that one day we will be with God, not only this, but we also exult in our tribulations. What does your translation say there? Exult. I'm not crazy about that word. I like rejoice better. I'm going to go to the ESV. Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So what is our great motivation behind all of this? Is it not love? Do you feel that? If you don't feel that, how can you be motivated by that? And how can you feel that if you don't understand that God has validated you? And how can you understand if God has validated you unless you've known that you've been separated from Him? That's why it's so important to pick up the Bible and become acquainted with its contents, or we will be lost in our faith. We won't understand the importance of being justified by God. You know what I love about that verse right there, the very first verse, when it says, you've been justified by faith? There's not a single word in that verse that has anything to do with your moral fortitude, your effort, your religious practice. Nothing in there about your baptism, about your church attendance. Nothing in there about you at all. You have been justified by an act of God. That's our motivation. That is some serious motivation. We'll look more into that. You have been validated. You have been healed. You have a Savior. You have a friend. You have a plan. You have a purpose in this life. There is meaning. There is hope. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. Doesn't that sound a little bit better than the exact opposite that we went through with talking about atheism? Doesn't that just feel better? Think about that. It's true. As much as the world will make you feel cheap and you don't matter. Everything is yours, Paul says. It means you can look up at the sky at night and feel poor, like you don't have anything. Everybody has everything, you don't. You're just like kicking rocks around. But you look up at the sky and you see the stars. It'd be the New Testament author's point to have you look at that and say, you are greater than those stars. In fact, you own those stars. Everything is yours. Everything is yours. I'm not trying to be like a motivational speaker. I'm really not. I don't believe in motivational speaking. I don't like some of those pastors that are on television that do that whole thing. But really, you need to understand, if you're going to live for God and love God, you need to understand that He's taken you from being absolutely nothing to being in His kingdom. You were separated from God. You were less than a worm. A worm does what He tells it to do. A worm digs holes and fertilizes the soil. You don't do anything God tells you to do. And yet He has brought you into His kingdom. He has ascended you into the heavenly places to sit with Him. That might seem too good to be true. That's why we call it the good news. That's why we have preachers. That's why we have evangelists, is to keep this message fresh. To remind people, don't get caught up in the lies. You're not worthless. You're not dying. You're not poor. You're not sick. That's everything that you're bringing in with the five senses. But there's a sense that's greater than that, and that's faith. And by faith, we understand that God, in just a few minutes, is going to take us to be with Him. So, yeah, when we look at the law, we have all these blind spots sometimes. You know, we were talking about earlier this morning about like wealthy people, extremely wealthy people, CEOs of companies, people that tend to have the temptation to. Not all are like this, but many fall into this proclivity. Is that they lose sympathy with people. They stop caring about people. They start to not see things the way that poorer people under them do. You know, and it's really just a blind spot. They're no worse than us. Nobody is worse than you. That's one thing I want to encourage you with, is you're far worse than you think you are. No one is worse than you. We all have our blind spots, and just like the wealthy person, sometimes we stick up our noses as well at people. How often does somebody get on your nerves? And who do we think that we are when we're doing these kinds of things? God's grace has made you smart, if you're smart, good looking if you're good looking, wealthy if you're wealthy. Everything that you've ever done that's good has come from God. You rely on God's grace for everything. You're not better than anyone. So look at me. You're way worse than you think you are. And that should keep you right at a balance there, to where you're not beating yourself up and you're not thinking that you're great. You're not looking at the law and saying, I can do this, because you're far worse than you think you are. And you're not looking at the law and saying, and just being completely overwhelmed by it, because you're far worse than you think you are. And that's what makes Jesus so beautiful, is the magnificence of your sin. When you take the attitude that my sin is not magnificent, that my sin is not great, my sin does not deserve the death penalty, my sin is not, it's not so bad. How often, every single day, do we justify little sins, this or that, whatever? I think we all do that kind of a thing. Now, I don't think that you should ever beat yourself up over something Jesus didn't die for. Okay? There's sometimes the church calls something that's a sin that's just not a sin. And if Jesus didn't die for it, you shouldn't call it a sin. We need to take the crucifixion of Jesus a little more seriously. He was beaten. He was mocked. He was dragged. He was flogged. And that word flog, that's just a really nice way of saying, they tore the skin off of his back. And they ripped the beard off of his face. And then they turned him around and they tore the skin off of his front. And then they pounded a crown of thorns onto his head and hit him on his head. And then, while he's all beaten, and a lot of people died from the flogging, they made him ascend a hill holding his cross, where they laid him down on it, nailed him in the most sensitive, painful parts of his body, and then hoisted him up at eye level so that whoever wanted to could come up to the cross and spit on him and mock him, spit on him with the glands that he designed into that human body. And so, when you say that you have no sin, or you don't see the magnificence of sin, I promise you, the cross is a glaring reminder that you're wrong. Crucifixion was so painful that you'd invariably see feces and urine at the base of it. Not to be graphic, but this is what it is. It was a torture method that was perfected by the Romans after hundreds of years of perfecting it, since the Persians invented it in 200 or 300 BC. And be careful when you go about your day justifying your sins, because Jesus had to be nailed for those sins. And be careful when you call your brother or sister a sinner, and they're not. You need to be careful about what you ascribe to the cross of Christ. If Jesus died for a sin, and you say it's not that big of a deal, you need to remember what happened to Jesus. And if you say you call your brother or sister a sinner, and they're not doing something sinful, you're making cheap the cross of Christ. You need to take that seriously as well. But rather we sing like David did in Psalm 40. He says, "My iniquities have overtaken me, and I cannot see. They are more numerous than the hairs on my head." He's singing this. This is not a sad song. This is a happy song. My sins outnumber the hairs on my head. For some of us, that's more significant. But one day in glory, I'm going to have just amazing hair, though. You better believe it. But he sings, "My sins are greater than the hairs of my head." David understood something more about grace. Okay? This is something that we need to take to a rest in our minds. This is when somebody says, "Set your eyes on Jesus," this is how that's done. All right, Jesus, let's go over to Luke 18. Luke 18, verses 19 through 14. 9 through 14. He tells this parable. I don't ever talk to an unbeliever or anybody on the street when we go out without bringing this up. I think it's just so important. It encapsulates sort of like just the essence of people's response to the loss sometimes. Ian says, he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. He says, 2 men went up into the temple to pray. One is a Pharisee. Pharisee is the most morally astute Jew who ever lived. I mean, the Pharisees took the law extremely seriously. Jesus said, your righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees. So even Jesus put a high premium on the righteousness of the Pharisees. But this is a parable to Pharisees about their righteousness. Okay? And he says, 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. And the Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself. God, I thank you that I am not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, and was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. And they were bringing even their babies to him, that he would touch them. But when the disciples saw it, they were rebuking him. Okay. So I have this caveat before I close. Is that if you're like this tax collector, you need to understand that you are more righteous than the Pharisee. And this is what I mean by that. I think every one of us, if we're a Christian today, are like the tax collector. But there's also the warning that I want to make, that I've seen so many people. I've kind of dealt with the issue that if you think that you're not a sinner, you need to reconsider that. I've done that in a broken, flawed, Joshua Holm kind of way. But I've met people that cannot forgive themselves, that beat themselves up like this tax collector so badly. And I want you to know that what you're doing is just as detrimental as that Pharisee. You need to put your faith in Jesus Christ, that He really did atone for your sins, that He really did forgive your sins. And look at me when I say this. When God forgives you of something and you don't forgive yourself of something, who's on the throne? It's like that verse, if God is for us, who could be against us? That applies also to yourself. If God has forgiven you, you should forgive yourself. God's forgiveness is supreme and authoritative. And so I also want to give the caveat that, look, I'm not up here to be an authority on this issue. You know, I'm not a perfect guy, and I rely on God's grace just as much as everybody else. And I have the proclivity to think that I can obey, that I have the moral fortitude. I have that proclivity at times. I also have the proclivity to think that, God's commandments are not applicable to me somehow. Somehow I do those mental gymnastics that even theologians, even great Christian pastors, can do that. All they'll do is just covenantally, theologically finagle their way out of a certain commandment and say, oh, well, that commandment right there, that was really just a cultural thing for that time. It doesn't apply to us. And so I'm just letting you know that I need your encouragement. We all need each other's encouragement to be reminded, look, you are a sinner and you rely solely on the grace of God. We all go by the grace of God. For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. If you're not ungodly, Christ didn't die for you. It's only the sick that need a physician. So if you think that you're not a sinner, you're on your own. You need to atone for your own sins. Christ died for those who raised their hand and said, I can't do it. I need a Savior. And Paul sort of just twists the knife on this one. To make it go in deeper into our hearts, he says, for one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would even dare to die. But God shows His love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So I'll close with that, and I'll pray. Father, it can be so difficult to believe in hope that we will one day be with you in glory. But you promised through your Son, I go to prepare a place for you, that where I go you may be also, and that when I return I will bring you to myself. In my Father's house there are many mansions. That were not true, I would not have told you. God, you have put your seal on Jesus. You have made your promises. You have sworn by your own name. And all that we have to do, Lord, all that we have to do is humble ourselves. Because the humble are exalted and the pride are brought low, Lord. The first will be last, and the last will be first. And you've designed this in such a way that just completely eliminates any kind of pride and boasting that we could possibly have. So God, please help break up some of that pride that's so hard in our hearts. Help us break those down so that we can live for you, so that we can rejoice in you, so that we can look at Romans 5 and it will break our hearts and say, I was such a sinner.